This is VEDN Day 12, and a few days ago I made a video called Réflexions sur le Georges Sorel. That's an approximation of how to pronounce it, but it was a video where I was talking about George Sorel. And my thing is, the video is about me being kind of frustrated, baffled, unable to understand the philosophy based on what I read. Wikipedia and Britannica have, I think, pretty insufficient summaries of Sorel. And I was also reading the chapter in Zeev Sternhell's book, The Intellectual Origins of Fascism, about Sorel. And man, that the way he's described at first in that chapter is really confusing. And so I was having a lot of problems understanding it. But since then I've read more of that chapter, and thankfully, as I hoped, I actually understand the topic a lot better now. I think it actually makes a lot of sense to me. I think Sorel makes a lot of sense. And so I'm making this video to clarify and explain a few things. Now, I still don't understand him entirely. There's still things that I'm not clear about. So maybe I'll make a third video about Sorel later in the month after even more reading. But yeah, what's the deal with Sorel? So I was under the impression, for some reason, that Sorel was not an accelerationist. I don't know exactly what led me to believe this, but reading about him more, it does appear that he was an accelerationist, but he just wasn't an accelerationist in the way that you might expect, because he wasn't a totally materialist accelerationist. So I'll explain that in a bit, but that was really messing me up, because I was like, okay, he's a socialist, he's a Marxist, but he believes in free market capitalism, but he's not an accelerationist. Huh? Well, it turns out he is an accelerationist, so I don't know where I was getting that idea from. But it's important to recognize that the whole material aspect of him supporting capitalism is not the primary sort of belief of Sorel's when it comes to accelerationism. So I'll get into that in a minute, but the main idea of Sorel, he was a revision of Marxism. Now, I thought that he was like, at first I was thinking, is this guy like some weird horseshoe theory revision of Marxism? No, he's not. He was a socialist. As far as I can tell, he was definitely a socialist. But he had some rather odd opinions related to that. And so it all kind of hinges around the whole turn of the century crisis of Marxism. Because in 1898 and 1899, there was a very famous sort of revision. It was called the revision debate around Marxism, and the key players were Edward Bernstein, Karl Kautsky, Rosa Luxemburg, and Vladimir Lenin. And I'm not going to get too much into Luxemburg and Lenin, but Kautsky and specifically Bernstein are quite important for understanding Sorel. Sorel was kind of an outsider. He was not an outsider, but he was kind of watching this debate from the bleachers. But he had his own perspective. So basically, the idea, Marxism is scientific, right? And so it's predictive. And so what happened was, in the 1890s, there were changes that were happening that were going against what Marx predicted, or seeming to go against what Marx predicted. And so that led to a crisis in Marxism where people had to somehow figure out, how do we rescue and revise this science of Marxism from this new data? And so Bernstein went in a particular direction. And his opinion was basically, the science is the problem, and we need better science. So we need to revise Marx's theory to fit with our new data. And his conclusion was that, okay, the kind of the main thing that we're talking about here, when we're talking about predictions that didn't come true, pauperization. Marx believed that that people would just get paid less and less over time. Wages would continue going down, and that this was kind of an iron law of capitalism. I think he called it an iron law of wages. That it just, capitalism, in order to stay competitive, would have to reduce wages. Turns out that's not true. It turns out that people were getting paid more. And that kind of threw a whole wrench in the scheme. And it also made a lot of socialists concerned, because they were thinking, well, our whole science is based on this premise that the dialectic of materialism is going to inevitably result in capitalism's undoing. That capitalism contains the seeds of its own undoing, and there's nothing that we can do about it. That it's an almost automatic process, that the material conditions will just bring about class consciousness, they'll bring about revolution no matter what, whether we like it or not. And so there's a great kind of security in that premise, and it made sense to a lot of people back then. It started to make a little bit less sense once it was being shown that, oh, actually this labor movement and the unions and the strikes are actually having an effect, and we're seeing reforms, and we're seeing companies start to pay people more, we're seeing better working conditions, we're seeing all these good things. But what are the long-term consequences of these good things? Is this going to prolong the state of capitalism? And so there are several ways you could handle this. But Bernstein was basically like, well, maybe the state of the new science, because it's saying that revolution isn't going to happen by itself, maybe it's not our purpose anymore to promote the idea of revolution, because it's not where we are finding the most gains. We're finding the most gains through reform. So let's focus on reform and try to achieve socialism through working through the established democratic institutions and the labor unions. And this made sense in that it was already seeing results. There were already results coming from this. And class consciousness wasn't diminishing. It was actually increasing. But at the same time, we were getting all these reforms. So if we could, keep increasing class consciousness through our propaganda, then we can keep getting these reforms. And with better living conditions, people will have more time to even think about reforms. And so there's a kind of logic to it. But Kautsky argued that, no, actually, what we're seeing here is short-term gains. But that doesn't mean that Marx was wrong. It just means we need to think more long-term about the material conditions, that it is through a period of repeated over and over crises of capitalism, that capitalism will be undermined, that it just won't be able to sustain itself long term. Yeah, well, it's been 100 years, 120 years since then, and it doesn't seem like we're in any different. We're any different than we were back then. It doesn't seem like capitalism is any more on its way out now than it was back in 1899. So, like, how long term are we talking about? You know what I'm saying? And so Sorel recognized this. Sorel recognized, same as Bernstein, that, yeah, the science, you can try to justify the science, but it's ultimately, it doesn't seem worth it. Seems kind of bullshit. But, you know, whereas Bernstein was like, we need better science. That's his answer. Sorel took a different approach. He said, well, maybe the fact that the science no longer works means that the science is no longer relevant. And maybe all this focusing on the science is pulling us away from what really matters. So, because Sorel recognized something about human psychology, which is that people aren't motivated as much by reason and rational argumentation and scientific principles as they are by ideals, by myths, by, you know, grand ideas that don't necessarily rely on a reason to be justified. They are justified in just the force of belief itself. And so Sorel looked at the situation and said, well, we need to stop focusing on all this scientific bullshit in Marxism and focus on what Marx, the contribution that Marx really added to socialist thought, which was, in his mind, not the science, even though he used to be a fan of Marxian science. In his mind, really, the real contribution was the revolutionary idea. And so focus on that and build this myth of the revolutionary idea in the proletariat so that that is a self-perpetuating, self-motivating thing that doesn't require reason. It doesn't require logical argumentation. And it's only through something with a force that powerful can you actually create a revolution that's going to work. And a revolution that's going to sustain itself and that's going to survive and weather the odds. And so what you have here is, like, both Bernstein and Sorel recognized a contradiction between science and revolution. And Bernstein was like, well, I guess the revolution is irrelevant. And Sorel was like, no, I guess the science is irrelevant. So they had two different answers to the contradiction. And so Bernstein's people became the Social Democrats. Sorel's people became the revolutionary syndicalists. And so it appears that Sorel believed that the syndicates, the fighting labor unions, they should take control of the economy through a general strike. And through the general strike, they can create the revolution because they have control of the economy. That's basic syndicalism, you know? And it makes sense. But one thing that's interesting about Sorel was that he was against democracy. Because he saw that, you know, people like Bernstein, maybe they thought that they were getting closer to socialism through democracy. But he was like, no, actually, it seems to me that all this emphasis on democracy and participation in civic life and government is actually taking you away from socialism, and it's empowering the bourgeoisie to kind of co-opt socialism. Because reforms placate people. Reforms make the proletariat less violent. And Sorel was all about the violence. And he understood that a violent spirit and temperament was necessary for a revolution. And he felt that the revolution was necessary because he didn't like bourgeois society, and he wanted to get rid of it. And he didn't think it was enough to simply reform it. He wanted to get rid of it. He didn't like the values of the bourgeoisie. He didn't like liberalism. And he didn't like, he wanted workers to be in control of the economy. And so he was against democracy. And this is something I'm not clear on, what is precisely the nature of his disagreement with democracy. But one theory I have, and this is something I'm kind of reading between the lines on, I don't have explicit confirmation of this, but it seems to me that what Georges Sorel's problem was that he felt that democracy was a big distraction, that it made people feel like they had a real say in things, and that would then make them less violent and less revolutionary, and that would only serve the interests of the bourgeoisie in the long run, because it would prolong their reign of power. But what he saw was the need for direct action. He thought that was way more important than democracy. And so he thought it doesn't matter what the state does or what it is. What matters is that people have the ability to band together as workers and challenge the state. That they have the ability to revolt against the state. And so he felt that, I think he might have been against democracy because he felt that democracy tricked people into thinking that they had more power than they actually did. Whereas if you have a straight up authoritarian government, then that provides the perfect enemy for the proletariat to rally against. And he was all about finding that kind of mythic charge, that kind of thing that could motivate people to violence. And having this authoritarian power telling you what to do all the time, that is going to really fire people up, he thought. And so he really believed in this idea of class warfare, class consciousness. People need to focus on this idea that we are against the rich. I'm still not clear about his long-term vision for society post-revolution. But it seems to me that he wanted a state of affairs where the people did not think about or rely on government for anything. So it's almost kind of an anarchic or anarchist kind of thing. But it would be where the syndicates take control through a general strike, and with that control there's this kind of independence of the proletariat, that they can do whatever they want because they have all the power. And so what's the government even gonna do at that point against them? Nothing. It can't do anything. But the people who ruin that for everyone are the bourgeoisie, the middlemen, the liberals, because as long as they have power of the economy, they're calling the shots rather than the proletariat. So I don't think he was an anarchist, but I think he did believe in government, but it would be a government that wasn't ruled by plutocrats, and the only economic power that really could have any influence in the government were the syndicates. That is kind of how I understand Sorelianism. Now, I'm going to be reading more about it, and so I might make some clarifications later. But it actually makes a lot of sense. This idea that, like, in psychology, the material needs are not going to motivate people to revolution when it's way easier to get satiated from reform. But since we need revolution and reform isn't good enough, in fact, reform is long-term bad, because we need revolution, we need something to motivate people beyond materials. And so that's where his mind turned to myths. And that's where he became kind of anti-rationalistic and focusing on... And so what's funny is that he defended the science of Marxism not from the point of view of rationality, from the point of view of, oh yeah, I have a really convincing argument for why the science of Marxism makes sense. He defended it because he wanted people to believe in it. And believing in it mattered more than whether it was true or not, because that belief would then lead to revolution. And so I actually find his philosophy very compelling. Obviously, for me, because I do believe in intellectuality, I can't get behind his kind of rejection of that. But his rejection of that is very solid, very grounded in a logic that makes sense. And I actually find I really like Sorel's philosophy. And it's interesting to see how similar it is to fascism, but also how different. Because it's very left, and I think the biggest thing that distinguishes it from fascism is this idea of class consciousness and the separation of classes and class warfare. Fascism is very against that. But in many other ways it's so similar to fascism, and so it's just fascinating seeing this very, very starkly left-wing root in fascism that, among other roots, contributed to this syncretic, beautiful synthesis that fascism became. So, very fascinating, and I keep learning about that stuff. I have a video about fascism coming up relatively soon, although I have to make some edits to it after reading all this stuff, because I did talk a little bit about the intellectual origins of fascism at the beginning of that. My camera doesn't want to record more than 23 minutes. I don't know why. 23 minutes at a time. 23 minutes at a time. Anyway, that fascism video, I'm going to have to make a few edits to the script after doing all this reading. But yeah, I hope I'll be able to get it out relatively soon. So this is VEDN Day 12, and I'll see you tomorrow for VEDN Day 13.